Alright guys, this is budget decks for the new expansion. We're going to go through 7 different decks that are crafted using mostly commons and rares, like maybe 1 or 2 epics, and in almost every case, no champion cards. Now, these decks are all very powerful. I can't stress that enough. Most of these are not going to be very different from their competitive counterparts. In fact, one of these 7 decks is actually arguably the strongest deck in the entire game, and it just so happens that it doesn't use any epics or champions. Literally 0 champions. Also, on top of that, every one of these 7 decks is, a budget deck to a competitive counterpart, which means as you build it out and as you get more resources, you can upgrade your budget deck into the slightly more competitive version, depending on the list you are using. And when I give you these links, and, as always, all the links are in the pinned comments, I'm going to attach the competitive counterpart so you guys know what to build into next. One of the greatest things about Legends of Runeterra, of course, being the fact that you don't really have to put money into this game. It's a great game to be a budget player in, not only because you get, card acquisition so quickly, but on top of that, some of the strongest decks in the game don't really take many resources to make. The starter champions, for example, are among the most used in the entire game, etc. And as you'll be able to see as we go through these lists, some of them are a little far off of their competitive counterparts. Some of them are identical, literally identical, or very close to their fully upgraded counterparts. And lastly, I'm going to link out 3 decks that are basically upgrades to the starter decks. So it's sort of a 3-step process. If you are a brand new player, you can take some of the upgrade to starter decks. Literally, I took all the 3 starter decks, I changed like 10 to 15 cards to make them quite a bit stronger, but I mean, that's like super budget, literally kind of like first steps that you might want to take as a brand new player. That's step 1. Step 2 is kind of the budget deck of your choice out of the 7 that we're going to recommend, and step 3 is the competitive upgrade to that. I'm not going to show you guys the starter deck upgrades right here, but it's going to be in the pinned comment. It's all linked out, and you can all basically just export the deck code into your client. Anyway, starting with the 7 budget lists, let's get into it. Okay, so starting off, we've got the budget Demacia list. This is a pretty standard mono Demacia playstyle. You are just running the Allegiance card in Bannerman. You have some high power tools, those being Grizzled Ranger and Loyal Badger Bear, as well as just like the kind of like very classic 1-2 punch in Fleet Feather Tracker and Brightsteel Protector. This is one of the easiest decks in the entire game, and it also happens to be one of the strongest. For the budget version, we're using a Citrus Courier in lieu of like an additional Cythria. Most of these decks are running at least 2 Cythrias, usually 3, but because it's an epic, it's a little bit harder to get. And we're running Laurent Protege instead of Fiora, which would usually be there to replace the Garen. So if you want to check this one out, as always, this is going to be the last time I'm going to say it, but it's in the pinned comment, and next to it, you'll also see the competitive upgrade to this list. All right. Okay, next up we've got the Bilgewater Freljord list. Now this is an elusives list. You are basically buffing your units as much as possible with Omen Hawk, as well as Shared Spoils, as well as Starlit Seer and some of the spell synergy package it entails, and permanent buffs like Pocket Aces and Take Heart, as well as temporary buffs like Fury of the North. You're combining your buff with elusive units. Elusive units can't be blocked, so basically when you make big elusive units, you are going to get a pretty free win since your opponent won't be able to really stop them. Elusives are some of the strongest cards in the game. Braum is here as effectively another buff target, and he can do kind of a good job of supporting around. And most importantly, we have a couple of Citrus Couriers that are going to help be ending the game. You get Plunder very easily because the elusives can't be blocked, and then you can of course Citrus Courier rally and do a full attack again for a very clean win. Alright, next up we've got the Freljord Shadow Isles list. This happens to be a personal favorite of mine. This is Allegiance Endure. Allegiance Endure is, I think, one of the stronger archetypes in the entire game, and we are running almost the exact list card for card. Now this isn't the deck I was talking about when I said this is literally the strongest deck, and at the end of the day, this is like literally a couple of cards different from what you would run if you had the cards. Mostly, for example, we'd have the third Elise, but this is almost exactly the same list as you would if you had more access to the cards. Here we have one Rasa because it's an epic. I've been throwing one epic into most of these just because, at least when I play on like a new account, I find that usually I have one or two epic wild cards lying around, and Rasa is going to pay off in really, really big value in a deck like this, especially when your opponents aren't playing around it. Basically, the idea behind this deck is pretty straightforward. You swarm the board really hard, your units generate more units, you've got units that play, cards that play multiple units like Bird Awakening and Wraithcaller. All of your cards are playing multiple units. Now you've got two payoffs to this. One of those payoffs is Neverglade Collector, which you're going to be dropping on like turn 5 or 6, and when your units die, you are basically going to force the opponent out of the game. It's a very powerful effect if they can't deal with it. Your second payoff is the Freljord card here, They Who Endure. This puppy is going to be played, usually not on turn 6. Oftentimes, you are playing this card in the later game. You can play it on like turn 6 or 7 sometimes. Most of the time, you will end up playing it like past turn 8. And it will come down as a really, really, really large unit. This is commonly a 20/20 unit. It's not that hard to get it to that stat line. And on top of that, you've got Atrocity. Atrocity is a great way for They Who Endure to finish the game for you. So what you're going to do is you're going to just stall out the game. This is a stall deck. You're basically using your small units to buy you time. You're not really meant to be killing the opponent's cards, although sometimes that does happen. And you're just chump blocking, or basically just using tiny dudes to stop the opponent's attacks. Until you get to the late game, you drop a They Who Endure. Then you attack with it so that the opponent will have to play their answer. Maybe they've got a Vengeance, or maybe they've got, a Will of Ionia or something, and then at that point, you Atrocity to counter, ending the game through their Nexus. Try to make sure your They Who Endure has enough damage to literally one-shot their Nexus. Okay, next up, we have the Ionia Demacia deck. So this is effectively Elusive's standalone, right? Now, this, you might notice there's a third Zed here. I'd recommend crafting a third deck. This is the one deck I was kind of like hinting at when I said there's basically one deck that I might recommend crafting a third champion. I think Zed is pretty great. You're not going to regret crafting him. But if you don't want to, replace it for the third Solitary Monk here in this deck. So this is the standalone Elusives deck that I am so known and so hated for. And basically the idea behind this deck is very, very simple. You skip the first 2 rounds, and then you play either Zed or Solitary Monk on turn 3, followed up with Standalone. A very powerful permanent buff, and when you buff either Zed, he gets the double body, or when you buff Solitary Monk, she has a very, very powerful elusive body. You can start ending the game really fast. Combine that with Relentless Pursuit, and you are often going to be winning games on turn 5 or 6. Right? It's pretty ridiculous. Now, there's going to be, you have to play it a little bit more flexibly. Sometimes you will end up, playing something like Green Glade Duo on turn 2 if you don't have the standalone in hand. Although I would never recommend playing Navori Blade Scout on 1. Contrary to, kind of popular belief, this card isn't meant to be played on turn 1 in this deck. You want to skip turn 1 even if it's in your hands. And you kind of want to be using it as a sort of damage spell later because it's elusive and it can't be blocked. Bonus points if you play it on the same turn as Relentless Pursuit, then you're getting the kind of like, you're double dipping into the temporary elusive, and usually that's going to be winning the game on that turn. Anyway, lastly, I just want to point out with this deck that a lot of your tools are basically keeping your things alive. You've got Chain Vest, Radiant Strike, Barriers, Twin Disciplines, and the entire reason for that is to make sure your big buffed unit or your elusive units don't die. So you're very protected against stuff like removal. Overall, this deck plays kind of high rolly. You will have you'll have an opening hand that you basically will know that you've already won the game, or sometimes you'll have a bad hand and you might not be able to win at all. So if that doesn't sound like your kind of deck, then, you know, you can table it, but I personally have a lot of fun with this one. Noxus Si deck. So this is basically spider aggro, and, you know, this is effectively almost one of the starter decks, because one of the starter decks does happen to be spider aggro, but a major step up on top of that starter deck, we've crafted quite a few cards for this. Now, in this version, we do have Darius, you know, as opposed to kind of the normal Draven that I personally favor, but here we have a lot of pretty powerful cards, mostly, you know, additional crowd favorites, and we've got a lot of just good swarm tools with stuff like extra rear guards, extra saboteurs, and extra precious pets. We're going to be rushing down the game very early and very fast. This is an aggro deck. You are basically just seeking to close the game very early and very aggressively, and you do so by swarming the board with tools like Brood Awakening, but unlike in the other spider deck, in the They Who Endure deck, this one will use spiders offensively. Just instead of like blocking bigger units, these are just gonna gun down your opponent's Nexus, and most importantly, you've got crowd favorite, which you want to be playing when you have an almost full board so that it can have a huge buff that's going to be winning you the game. Next up, we've got Ionia Freljord, which is, hey, another Allegiance deck. It just so happens that 3 of the decks on this list ended up being Allegiance decks, which is not too surprising. In this case, our Allegiance card is going to be Kinko Wayfinder, and that's going to be pulling out Omen Hawks as well as Blade Scouts. If you're familiar with, you know, this sort of the list, which, you know, is a very, very common list in ladder, it's basically kind of like an elusive buff deck, sort of similar to the Bilgewater one, but this time we're running a lot of kind of like the Ionia tools of being able to stall out the game and go a bit longer. We're not going as heavy on the buffs in this deck, but we do have more ways of kind of like making it to the late game. Jeweled Protector is going to be buffing. It's a very slow buff card because it only comes out on turn 5 and it buffs in hand. So this deck ends up kind of a bit slower, but you've got huge punch through potential with Windfarer Hatchling. Now, this is a 2 of, and it is, in this case, an epic. I would highly recommend crafting 2 of this card if you're going to want to play this deck. But yeah, this deck is sort of one of the more expensive ones here because I am very much recommending 2 epics if you want to play this deck. What this list is going to want to do is try to replay Omen Hawk as much as possible. You're going to bounce it with Navoric Conspirator so that you can play it again. You're going to use Kinko Wayfinder to pull it out of your deck so you can play more of them. The more times you summon this card, the more buffs you're going to get. Overall, this deck is very similar to the other one we saw, the Bilgewater Freljord elusive deck. They are going to play for pretty similar conditions and honestly exist at pretty similar power levels. So I would just recommend, you know, kind of having a look over at the cards and picking whichever playstyle appeals to you. They're really not too different at the end of the day. And then lastly, we have the deck itself, Noxus Si Burn, without any champions, without any epics, and this is the deck I was saying is arguably the strongest deck in the game. It is all over Master's Ladder. This exact deck, this is not a budget version of a deck. This is actually a very, very high level competitive deck, and it just so happens that it's running no champions as well as no epics. So if you want wins, and if you want those wins fast, this is the deck for you. This is the deck to beat all decks. At the end of the day, this deck is, well, I gotta be honest, it's a little disgusting, and it'll do very, very well for you. Effectively, this is a burn style aggro. Now, what burn means is kind of like spells that are dealing damage as opposed to attacks that are dealing damage. So you play some early units to get some chip damage in, but very immediately your strategy is just going to switch to spell-based damage. So you get a few attacks in with your units, and then for the rest of the game, you just play spells that damage the opponent's Nexus. It's honestly that simple, and with new additions to the game, such as Imperial Demolitionist and Noxian Fervor, but this deck is just crazy. The opponent's Nexus will simply run out of health, and they'll lose, because when your Nexus is at 0 health, you can't play the video game anymore. Now, the one potentially minor caveat to crafting this list, and this is pretty minor, this list is not going to be bad. It's not really going anywhere, but there is a good chance this is going to get nerfed in the next like week or so, which, you know, I don't expect it to be gutted. They've never really done something like that, and I don't think it's necessarily warranted. They'll probably just like bump one or two of the cards down, and I expect this to remain a very powerful list. But yeah, I would be a little surprised if, you know, one of the cards here didn't get minorly nerfed in some way soon. And there you have it. These are the 7 budget decks that will take you quite far. All of these are very powerful lists. Some of them will take you up to Masters, while others are going to have, you know, a bit of a harder time past, let's say, you know, Plat or Diamond, around those levels. But all of these decks are going to take you very far, and these are all like really powerful ways. So I'd recommend, at the end of the day, you know, picking whatever playstyle appeals to you more. You know, I've been kind of like stroking off this deck. This is like, listen, this is a very powerful list. But at the end of the day, these are all solid lists, and if you are a semi-new player or even a returning player looking for a budget option, all of these will feel very strong, and at the end of the day, I would pick what kind of like playstyle or maybe regions appeal to you more. And that's basically everything we have for you. So go ahead, try one of these decks out, maybe a couple, hit the ladder, and have a good time ranking up with some nice cheap decks. Anyway, I'm out. Later, boys.